Hi, Tuck's my name, guitar's my game. Glad you came. Okay, welcome to this Hot Licks video. I've been doing this for quite a while now, this solo guitar thing, but actually I did a lot of things before then, and people generally know me as doing solo guitar and rhythm section, one-man rhythm section kind of thing. So that's what I'll try to demonstrate at this point, but it's going to be unavoidable that I'll make reference along the way to a lot of things that I picked up earlier in about probably 15 years of playing the guitar before I started doing this solo thing. Since 1978, I've really been doing exclusively duo guitar, and along the way kind of inadvertently picked up a lot of things about solo guitar. But what I found the thing I love to do most is just play with one other person. In my particular case, it's with my wife, who's a great singer, Patty. And so what I'd like to do is really get into the kind of grooves and textures that I end up developing when the two of us play together. What I've found is one of the best places to start with this kind of thing is with walking bass. Everybody's always curious about how do you do walking bass? How do you keep more than one part going, and why, for that matter? The why is a little bit easier to talk about than the how. My experience has been that it's a completely different thing. I remember for many years I used to argue with people that I should do this, even though it sounded better to do the various parts independently with different instruments. And what I found was you could get 3 or 4 people to play what I was playing and to do a better job of it, especially when I started out. And still, it seemed like such a great challenge, I had to keep doing it. And what's finally developed is a different style that sort of stands on its own, even though it's always making reference to the whole bands that I've always listened to and played with. So along the way, one of the things I'll keep coming back to is it's important to listen to the music that you derive this from. Don't just listen to me or listen to solo guitar players trying to sound like bands. Better to listen to the bands and then try to sound like the band when you're a solo guitar player. Nobody's going to ever mistake you for the band. But what I found is that if I'm thinking about the Count Basie band or Earth, Wind and Fire at the time that I'm playing, it comes out sounding a lot more like real music than if I'm thinking about what can I do on the guitar. So I'm going to start off with walking bass, and I'm going to start fairly simply to try to illustrate some of the different problems that you run into when you combine different parts. I think we'll use a blues as an example here. So we're going to do, I guess we should tune first, come to think of it. Let's tune. How about an E? This is E. Let's try another E. Here's an E chord. Okay, so we want to move in the direction of doing something like this. Okay. First, let's start off just getting a bass line happening and working on independence of feel. That's been my main experience when I've run into a lot of students that have played this style. My main experience has been that they have a tendency to feel the same way whether they're doing the bass line or the chords. It always all comes out choppy. Or it all comes out legato. Whatever it is, it doesn't come out quite sounding like music, and what I finally came up with was the difference is independence of feel between the two parts. This is the main thing I've learned in solo guitar is you want the different parts to sound like what they're derived from. So the bass line wants to sound like a bass would sound. You wouldn't go around playing a walking bass line sounding like this. You would tend much more to make it legato. In fact, you might even liven it up a little bit if you didn't have anything else to do. So the trick is not to let all those details and all that richness that makes it music disappear at the point where you start to try to combine the parts. So let's take a very simple example and piece it together. First, let's just get the chords down. We're just going to take 2 bars out of a blues, just G13th to C9th. First, we're going to construct a bass line that gets us from point A to point B. That's going to be the one I just played. By the way, I'll give you a set of rules here, and there aren't very many of them, that if you program those rules into your robot, put a tuxedo on them, you could probably take them out and pay them $50 a night and pocket all the money yourself. But you could actually get a robot to sound pretty much like a bass player if you eliminate all the creativity from him. And what I found is that on the guitar, when you're doing the solo guitar thing, it's not as critical to go as far into to be as advanced. That's what I'm trying to say. You don't have to play a super advanced bass line in order to make solo guitar walking bass sound convincing. You don't have to be an incredible bass player. You just have to get from point A to point B in a reasonable way. So what I call these is workhorse bass lines, rules for making a workhorse bass line. And the general idea is you want to walk from one point to another, walk through a scale. And if you get there too soon, add some chromatic notes. So if you don't want to walk all the time, because that'll get really boring, then you can jump around. But in order to sound like you're relating in any way to the chord changes, you want to jump around among notes of the chords. Now, you can jump all you want to in a situation like that. You can actually go, and that works just fine, as long as you ultimately lead into the chord. And you notice the last note I play before the new chord is always close by the note I'm aiming at, a whole step or a half step away from it. Or so that alone will get you making a reasonable bass line that works pretty well. Now you want to combine some chords with that. If you're playing the bass line with your first finger, you've only got 3 other fingers around to make the chord, unless you use your thumb somewhere. We won't do that. So let's get this 13th chord with the other 3 fingers. So now we're going to get this. We use the C9th this way. You may find that you want to do this. I'll talk later about reasons you might want to use alternate fingerings. So let's build this up with a very simple rhythm first, which is no rhythm except for the bass. Okay, doesn't really sound like too much. Usually when you're comping in swing, you don't just play whole notes in the chords. It's a lot more effective to come up with some kind of rhythmic pattern that works. And one that I discovered after doing this for several years that I was doing all the time was this one. And that turns out for some reason to be pretty easy. Now, the trick to this is getting your bass to be legato while you're making the chords nice and staccato. Notice I didn't go. Instead I went. But at the same time, the bass was nice and legato underneath. And by getting this kind of contrast in legato versus staccato of the different parts, what you really do is emphasize the difference in the two and make it seem bigger than it is. It's still just the guitar, but you give the effect of two or more different instruments this way. It turns out to be really important in solo guitar style. And I think it's one of the places where guitarists' ears just tend to turn off at the point where they're going through all the complexity of working this stuff out in the first place. It's very easy to lose sight of the thing that got you hooked on this idea in the first place, which was getting those sounds out of your instrument that you're used to hearing. So in some other style, you may want to have a really staccato bass line while you've got a legato chord part, or every possible mixture of those two as the parts go by. It's just worth keeping your eyes open and especially your ears open. Don't let them close up when things get really rough, which they do periodically. So anyway, let's get back to some of the rhythms that you can use here. There's not a lot of variety in the bass rhythm. Of course, you can do little ornaments. So we'll worry about those kinds of things later, but the basic pulse in the bass line is obviously just repeated quarter notes. On the top, on the other hand, you're completely free, and if you listen to piano players and guitar players comp, which is what you should really do, you'll see every possible rhythm that you can imagine. And I know from my own experience, this solo guitar thing developed, or the duo accompaniment guitar style developed completely on the gig. Patty and I got together, and I played in 200 or 300 bands before I started doing this. And we decided, well, let's go get some work in the meantime as a duo. That should be easy, and it'll be quick, and we like playing together. And so we had the work before we knew how to do it, especially before I had any idea of how to keep this stuff together. And so all my learning of this stuff just happened on the gig based on other music that I'd played. And then later on I started analyzing it, mainly as I started having students who wanted me to break it down. And it was at that point that I discovered certain rhythms that were showing up over and over. But I realized that the rhythms that I'd pulled out just came from the listening that I'd done, whether it was to a Miles Davis quintet or to a big band or whatever it was. I was listening to those different kinds of rhythms. So again, at the risk of overstating this point, you can get some of these ideas from me, and especially you can see how I as a guitarist have put them together on the guitar. But don't stick with the kinds of elementary rhythms that I'm suggesting, which would be enough to see you through for a lifetime, really. Instead, listen to the music you love, whether it's coming out of your fingers or somebody else's fingers. Listen to that music and find the kinds of rhythms that really hit you, and then just figure out a way to do it. So let's pretend that the rhythm that you love the very most is one of the ones that I'm about to show you. I mentioned before the one that I discovered after about 2 years that I was playing very consistently, which was this. Now, a variation on that would be to sustain the last note. And you notice you run into all kinds of fingering problems as you go along. One of the things that always happens is that guitarists who do something a lot make that look very easy, and you don't see all the kinds of things that they've wrestled with along the way. And if you haven't played this style that much, you might find that you're wrestling with all kinds of things that it looks like just somehow magically don't exist for me. And of course, the truth is that I wrestled with all the same things that you're about to or already have yourself. And in many cases, you're going to come up against a decision: do I do it this way or do I do it that way? And for a long time, I had the opinion that you should either do it this way or you should do it that way. And now I've come up with the opinion that you should do it both ways and any other way you can think of. And that way you'll be flexible enough to do it however you want to when the time comes up. And here I'm referring specifically to things like, do you finger the bass line on this string? Or do you put it here? Well, it has a lot to do with what you're going to do with the higher part. Well, the best example I can come up with at the moment has to do with, let's say you're walking back down from this chord. You get to this point. Should you have fingered it here? Or should you have fingered it here? Maybe should you have fingered it this way? You can come up with all kinds of different fingerings. And the answer is, for flexibility, do it every possible way you can think of. Because the whole goal with this is to be like you would if you were just doing one of these parts. You'd be nice and free and relaxed. Let's imagine you've played the style for years. It's very conversational for you. You're free to improvise, respond to whatever you're hearing around you. After all, you're responding to somebody else you're playing with. If you're locked into always fingering it the same way, then you don't have that kind of freedom. One of the great things about watching a guitarist like Joe Pass is you can see almost infinite freedom in his fingerings. At any point, he can go from any note to any other note, seemingly anywhere on the neck, and he's not locked into a particular pattern or a particular musical pattern that he's played over and over again. It's all really free. So the argument is to finger these in any way you can. Of course, now when you're just going for it, which is what I did for the first many years that I did this style, get anything you can, and with the fingers that are left over, get anything else that's available, and just good luck, basically. Another rhythm that that you can use, and the reason I got off on this was talking about sustained notes. As soon as you get sustained notes, it gets a little bit more difficult because you've got to be moving a bass line around at the same time that you're holding down a chord. And you get into this thing where before you were forcing yourself to be legato in the bass and staccato in the chords. Now you've got a whole different approach going on. The extreme of this would be whole notes like we were talking about before. Okay, now here's an interesting fingering problem. I won't get into too many of these, but how are you possibly going to go and then play a bass line that goes without letting this chord up? Well, there you get into questions of altering your technique, for example, or altering your fingering. Maybe you'll finger it this way, which takes care of all that, but now what are you going to do about that A flat? You don't have any fingers on the other side of this one. Well, you got your thumb, or maybe you'll do this. So you might end up with a crossed finger, or you'll just fake it, you'll lose the chord at that point. But if your concept is you want to hear the whole note ringing, and that's really your musical idea, then it's worth figuring out some way to create that effect. Maybe you'll give up one note in the chord. I gave up the third of the chord, and the chord was just these two notes instead. I lost that note. If you want to get really absurd, then you can start doing this. I can't, but you can. So there's usually some kind of fingering that will solve the problem. Most likely one you haven't thought about, and it'll take you into a kind of strange position. My experience with this style, though, has been I've gotten so flexible with fingerings as a result of having to do this all the time, both in real time and then going home working out little things that repeatedly don't go smoothly, that when it comes time to play with a band and play something like more the normal style of guitar that I was used to before then, I have incredible flexibility in my left hand to just about do any kind of chord voicing I can imagine, all kinds of things that I wouldn't have thought were possible before, or transitions from one chord to another that I wouldn't have imagined being able to pull off, now are really pretty easy to me because I'm just in the habit of working with that all the time. So it has all these kinds of unseen fringe benefits. So let's look at another rhythm or two you could use with this. There's an extremely common rhythm. I've heard it called the Charleston rhythm, this one. Here it is with the bass. Okay. You could also sustain one of those notes. Sustain the first one. Notice I'm fingering in a different way both times because I'm just doing this in real time, and if I didn't get the fingering right the first time around, I'll change it in order to get the sound I'm looking for the second time. Or you might sustain the second one. I don't think that'll sound very good. That doesn't sound very good at all. Let's do it anyway. So it's worth looking at sustain also as a way to vary the rhythms that you're doing. It won't end up being a big difference in fingering, but it's a great big difference in sound. Okay, so what you want to do initially, I'm going to back up one step because I've seen some people take to this very quickly, and I've seen some people have a great deal of difficulty with it, and for myself it's been the same thing. Certain rhythms turn out to be very easy for me, and certain ones turn out to be really hard when you get into independence. At the point that you run into one that's difficult, and let's imagine that one of these is difficult for you at this point, then the thing to do is break it down, simplify everything else. And this always applies when you're trying to work on more than one thing at a time. When you think about it, music is comprised of a lot of things all the time, and so this really applies all the time. If what you're working on is too hard, find a way to simplify out some of the variables or some of the issues that you're dealing with so you can focus on the others. In this case, you're really talking about some issues of independence in the right hand. It would be worth doing nothing but this. Because you may have a tendency to do this instead. Where the bass line is actually going, because you find it difficult to separate the thumb from the fingers. Again, this is something I've done a lot, and if you've played certain kinds of fingerstyle guitar, it won't be any problem for you to do this. If you've always played with a pick, it could be a completely different story. Again, simplifying is a good idea. Likewise, with this independence of feel that I'm talking about, it's worth, there are 2 or 3 kinds of exercises you can use. One is playing the specific musical pattern, making a point of holding one finger down. It doesn't even have to be a musical pattern for that matter. It can just be the act of holding one finger down while you separately attack the chord with the other fingers. And you'll notice that I'm not even plucking it with my right hand. What I'm trying to do is get a kind of pianistic approach to the neck where my hand is down when I need it and it comes off the note when I don't need it anymore. So you get something like this. Or now, your first finger won't always be on the bass. It happens that that's one of the easiest ones from the standpoint of independence. But let's imagine that let's say you're right in the middle of a chromatic line. Your second finger is on the bass, but you're still on that chord. This is much harder to do for me, and I'm assuming for you, but you should do it. Likewise, well, if I can't do it, I shouldn't ask you to do it, but you should do it anyway. If not that chord, some other chord, in order to develop the independence by which you could hold one finger down while attacking with the other 3 fingers. It's easier with your pinky. So along the way, you're going to find that any different finger might be on the bass note. And that also has a lot to do with voicings, which is a related subject here. Your whole career won't be just spent going from G13 to C9 to the 3rd fret. You may very well be going anywhere, and you may happen to land on any finger and need a particular chord. Let's say you're going, and somewhere around in here you decide you want a chord. Okay, well, you're already on this finger, so that means these 3 fingers have got to find the chord. But there are probably all kinds of G7th chords and G13th, G9th, and all the other related chords around here. It's just a matter of mapping out the notes. I mean, it happens that we've got the same ones available. But then we've got this one, that one, that one. You could suspend it. This is all while this is happening in passing. So you get the idea here. You don't have to always be thinking about the standard chord forms that we've all grown up thinking about. This is to try to widen the focus for a moment. This is one of the things that I've found plagues guitarists all the time, and it certainly did me for a long time, which is a kind of, I guess it's an insular approach to the guitar in that we develop these little islands where we're safe in fingering. You know, I've got this one, I've got one up here, maybe I've got this one, maybe I even know my inversions, and I've got this one and this one and that one and that one. But still, these are what some people call grip chords, ones that you learn but you don't see all the other available chords around there. It's worth, especially in connection with this kind of style, it's worth trying to develop all the voicings you can so that you'll be more flexible, like a pianist is. That should be your goal on guitar, to have the kind of flexibility that a pianist would. And the biggest differences are that it's easy to see on the piano and it's easy to play. And those are two pretty big differences. So what I would encourage you to do is, let's say that it's a G7th chord or G9th or G13th. Just try to visualize those notes all up and down the whole fingerboard, every note that you might find in a G dominant chord. So let's say we'll include all those notes. The root, the ninth, the third. We'll skip the fourth because that would be a suspended chord and that's a different sound. The fifth, the sixth or 13th, the dominant seventh. You're back to where you started from. Okay, now you're going to find those on all the strings. Oops. So they're all over the place. Now this is the way a piano player sees quite naturally, because you can see what notes you're playing all the time. Now once you've got those mapped out, and I would suggest that you write it out unless you're really familiar with this, then just start combining notes, work your way up the fingerboard. These are more or less random combinations of those notes. Some should sound good, some should sound kind of strange. Maybe in doing this process, you might start to see some voicings that you would never have even dreamed of playing, and start thinking about ways you might figure out to actually physically play these. For example, if you happen to come across this combination of notes functioning as part of the G7th family, then by the time you've gone through this process, you'll be thinking about what are some adjacent notes on one of these strings. Okay? For example, you could raise or lower this note on the string. But let's say instead you want to raise or lower the top note. Well, raising's not too much of a problem. Lowering is too much of a problem. But you might start thinking about that sound. It might open you up to that sound, and you might say, okay, I want to find some way of getting that sound at some point. Maybe you play it up here. It's a lot easier. So what I'm suggesting is a way of essentially demystifying chords as much as possible. There aren't that many different types of chords on the guitar, and in the space of an afternoon you can basically work out every conceivable G7th chord that any human being has ever played or ever could play. And then that puts you on a pretty even footing with everybody else. It still comes down to what you're going to do with all of that and whether you can remember any of them. But it's quite remarkable if you use that approach, which I think of as chord maps. I map out all the notes and then just randomly combine them or combine them based on some kind of parallel motion. It's quite remarkable what you can accomplish in a real short time. You're bound to find all kinds of voicings you wouldn't have thought of. So this was a digression along the way because I was talking about coming up with voicings you can use in this walking bass line thing. The problem with the walking bass line is that at any given point you might be at any fret with any finger playing the bass line. I mean, chromaticism is at the heart of jazz, and we're talking about more or less a jazz style here. And you're surely not capable enough to plan what you're doing in advance if you're ever going to be an improviser, so much that you can always land on the finger you, in an ideal world, wish you had landed on. So instead, you've got to land on that finger and then make do with what you've got, make the best out of your circumstances. So if I happen to land with my third finger on a B flat, and I want a G7th chord because that's what's really going on at that point, chances are very good that I have never fingered a G7th chord that has a B flat in the bass with my third finger, because there isn't one. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of notes all around here that are in the G7th family that I've worked out time and time again because I've been doing this whole chord mapping process that I was just describing a minute ago. And so I land on the third finger and I see, okay, I see all these chords, all these notes in the chords. Well, there's that one. There's that one. Maybe there's this one. Now in context, you're probably saying that sounds horrible, which it does. That's only because the B flat is a passing note in the bass. In context, it sounds fine. It's only natural that you'll have that dissonance along the way. So anyway, you can come up with any kinds of voicings you want to. It's like every other aspect of this. You can go as far into it as you want to, or not very far at all, and you can still make all kinds of music with it. One of the beauties of this style is that once you get some of the basics down, you'll find that, as I said before, you don't have to be a great bass player. You also don't have to know every voicing in the world, and you don't have to know every tune in the world to entertain yourself for hours at end, and entertain other people too. Okay. Now I want to extend this idea of rhythms a little bit and talk about a concept of using systematic thinking about rhythms to increase your options here. And specifically, I'm saying that if you break down the components of rhythms, of comping rhythms, we're basically talking about an eighth note pulse. If you played every single eighth note, you'd really have a shuffle, just like I was playing. So most of the rhythms that you can use to comp with fall on one of those 8 places. Of course, we're talking about swing eighth notes, so they're not strict eighth notes, they're really triplets. So what you want to do is have the freedom and the flexibility to be able to attack any of those or any combinations of those that you want to. You immediately run into some independence problems. So I would suggest doing some systematic working with rhythms in order to get yourself nice and free so that certain ones aren't a lot easier than others, because the easy ones are the ones you're going to do. So let's do some things that'll make them all equally easy. That's the goal here, really. So one set of those eighth notes that you can do is the set that coincide with the bass notes. That's pretty easy. Actually, you'll notice I'm still using the independence. The bass note is just sitting there. It's legato. The comp is staccato. Not just staccato because I cut it off in the right hand somehow. You'll never make it if you just do it that way. Instead, it's staccato because I'm only holding it down a short time with the left hand. So you get that sound. So you can expand that and carry it all the way through the progression, doing something like this. You notice it's a little bit difficult for me to keep track of which finger is supposed to be staccato and which one is supposed to be legato. You'll have that same problem, which is one of the reasons you want to slow this down a bit, and exactly one of the reasons that you should do this exercise just like I should have. The other contrasting one would be this. There all the chords are coming on the off beat. Those are the contrasting beats to the on beats. And so you get a sound like this. Of course, most rhythms are mixtures of those two things, and that's where you get things like, which is on the beat, off the beat. Or repeated notes, 2 eighth notes in a row. Okay, now what I want to suggest is make up some rhythms that you can run all the way through a set of changes. And you can do this with standard changes or blues or whatever song you're interested in working with. And I look at those as just rhythmic rudiments. What we've been talking about so far are ones that repeat every bar. It's the same rhythm over and over again, every bar. You could also have ones that alternate, like but what I'm also interested in is suggesting that you make ones that repeat every, let's say, 3 eighth notes. course, you're going to run up against all the same kind of fingering problems that you're watching me run up against right now, and do my best to pretend that I can solve in real time. One of the advantages of doing those that are not just a bar long, but that what this particular one is you hit an eighth note, then you leave 2/8 rests. So it's really 3/8 notes long. So one of the advantages of doing that is that you don't come out even at the end of every measure. You might come out even at the end of every 3 measures. In the case of blues, that means that at the end of a chorus of blues, you'll come out even because there are 12 bars of 4 beats each, and you divide that by 3 and it comes out even. If you do a standard tune that's got 16 bars or 32 bars, then at the end of a chorus it won't come out even. You'll have to go around 3 times before it'll come back to where you started from. And that's a good challenge. If you can get all the way through a tune, once for that matter, but if you can get all the way through the tune 3 times and come out where you started from and actually solve all the fingering problems, then you're likely to develop a great deal of flexibility when it comes to comping and actually improvising rhythms along the way. Okay, let's go on to what I think is as important as the variety, and that's the feel. The one thing that I've been trying to leave out all this time has been what I think of as the third part that you always want to have in there. It tends to bring everything to life, and that's the percussion, specifically the backbeat. It happens on 2 and 4. There are all kinds of ways you can achieve it, but check out the difference between the first way, which will be without it, and the second way, which will be with it. We're hoping that the second way sounded more like music to you because it had one of those critical parts, which is the percussion. Okay, so the backbeat is a click on the strings of one sort or another. If you're not doing anything else at the same time, you can do this. I'm just clicking my fingers into a kind of ready position to pluck the next chord. So if you're comping on every other beat, 1 and 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'd get this. Of course, you won't be doing that. What you'll be doing is playing a bass line at the same time and doing a syncopated comp. So let's look at the different aspects of that, and then we'll combine them. We're now talking about 3 parts, by the way. We're talking about the bass, we're talking about the chords, and we're talking about the backbeat or the percussion. So rather than try to put all 3 together at the same time, it makes more sense, in line with what I was saying before, to simplify. Take 2 parts, work it out for the 2 parts, and then see if we can get the third part in there. Okay. With respect to the bass is happening on every beat. And unfortunately, the comp has to happen at the same time, or unfortunately, the percussion has to happen at the same time as the bass. My experience has been this is a little bit harder than it looks because it's unnatural if you haven't done it a lot. That being the case, simplify it by doing it very slowly. The other way to simplify it is to exaggerate it drastically. What you'll notice is you have to make a different stroke on the bass if you're at the same time slamming your hand down against the strings. But you can still, if you do this enough, you'll find that it's possible to get a pretty even sounding bass stroke, and you just make some sort of little adjustment. Your hand will gradually make that adjustment because your ear will force it to. Okay, for the comp, it's the same kind of thing. Let's say we're going to do this pattern. This pattern is a forgiving one because you don't have to comp and do the backbeat at the same time. You can do the comp followed by the backbeat and then the next stroke. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Others are not quite so forgiving. Take the extreme case where you're comping on every quarter note for some reason. Well, how are you possibly going to do a click to mute the strings at the same time as you're hitting a chord? And the answer is, of course, you're not going to do that. Instead, what you're going to do is do a different attack on that chord so that it sounds more percussive. And what I do is something along the lines of this. Where the percussive stroke is a downstroke with an open hand. To heighten the percussive effect, I actually do this with my fingers too, a little bit. So instead of just this, it's this. It's both a stroke and an opening and closing of the hand at the same time. So now you've got all the parts grouped in twos. Bass and chords, which we've done before, the bass and percussion, and the percussion and the chords. Now you want to put them all together. Notice that in line with what I was saying before about simplifying, I'm only playing one note, and I'm only playing one comp chord, and I'm only playing one repetitive rhythm. Later, of course, you want to introduce the other notes, work out the chord changes, and get some kind of flexibility in your comping patterns. So what I'm suggesting is that you think of each of these three parts as a separate one, and then work on ways of combining two of them until you get that, and then you'll have to slow it down again and work on a way of getting all three of them to happen at the same time. All of what I'm talking about the backbeat here is going to apply totally if we're talking about funk rhythms or if we're any kind of rhythm you're talking about. The percussion is still the same kind of issue. And typically in the kind of music that I'm dealing with anyway, we're talking about some kind of click on 2 and 4. Okay, I'm actually going to do a chorus of blues here and just try to incorporate what we've talked about so far with some rhythmic variety, some keeping the backbeat going, and varying the voicings as well. I'm going to try not to incorporate all the other little details that'll make this come alive past that. So let's do that. So you can get something really reminds you of music out of just a few little things like this by putting it together. However, it's very hard for me to restrain myself from doing all the other kinds of things that bring it even more to life. One is a kind of triplet technique or Raschiato approach. The great guitarist Buddy Fite used this actually way better than I do. I admire his use of this a great deal. I do it as a kind of loose stroke to create a triplet feel, and let me demonstrate it first and talk about it. What Buddy did was much more clear articulation on every string. So if you incorporate that into the song, it brings all kinds of extra rhythmic life into it. Okay, you'll probably find other ways of getting the same effect. That's the one that I use most of the time. The other one is various kinds of triplet rhythms in the comping. Especially on turnarounds is a good place to do this. And a suggestion would be just think of any kind of triplet rhythm that you can come up with independently of playing the bass line and the comp at the same time. Just work on the comp, make up all the cute triplet rhythms you can, and if you need to, write it out in order to remember what you came up with, and then say, now how am I possibly going to combine that with the bass line? Well, there's a handful of other techniques that I should probably mention here, little details that bring this thing more and more alive, and what I've found is that it becomes a kind of exercise until you finally get everything in there. Once everything's in there, for me at least, it becomes one of the most fascinating things you can do on the guitar. because it's just endlessly challenging, and it's as rich as music can get just out of one instrument. So let me illustrate some of those other ones briefly. One is doing pull-offs in the bass. This is a standard technique you see bass players, upright bass players use. Instead of, you get this. What I'm doing is, whenever I have the opportunity, at the last minute before going to the next note, I actually pull this note off. On one string, it's very easy to see. And you don't quite hear that low E note. You're not just trying to create a really lethargic kind of shuffle in the bass. You're trying to get that percussive pop that comes from pulling off the string and catching it the next instant. So you don't want the note to ring long enough to even be able to distinguish the pitch. A lot of the time you can't get that for fingering reasons, but you can throw some of those in. In just a minute I'll do that. Another one is playing off beats with your index finger. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. I illustrated this earlier without talking about it. That's doing off beats in the bass. Instead of and so forth, you can bring it a little more to life just by anticipating some of the notes with your index. Gives it much more of a sense of life there. And so whenever that index finger isn't doing something else, it can be doing that. The other thing it can also be doing is the same thing, only on the bottom of the chord. You get the idea for that. Okay, and final thing is just details. When you think about your guitar playing, think of everything else you do that gives it any kind of life. And the two that particularly come to my mind are sliding, which is very idiomatic on the guitar, and vibrato or bending. All those kinds of things can happen in this style too. So everything that you know you can cram into this style, and it just gives it more texture and more density and makes it seem less and less like a caricature of music and more like real music. So you can, fingerings come into question immediately with the sliding. You might want to go. Now the effect you want is this, while this note's ringing. So you find a fingering that's an alternative fingering that allows you to keep this finger down while you move the other three. Things like vibrato, you just notice me do little shakes. So all the different things you know about you can do, including bending. If you know your double bends, you can use those in there. Anything you use, put them in there. So when you put it all together with the pull-offs over here, and the off beats in your index finger, and sliding, vibrato, anything else you know, you get something that's pretty rich. And so I'll play another couple of courses of this just to try to put it all together for you. We'll see what comes out. Okay, I think I'll change directions here for a minute and say you want to do something besides blues and G, swing. And what I would suggest is work out other styles of music, obviously. And what really got me started doing this was not the traditional jazz stuff in the first place. It was all the years that I spent playing in soul bands and funk bands where we didn't have enough people to go around to cover all the parts, and so I started doing more than one part at once. And I kind of got into the back door of this walking bass thing. Although I'd heard it done a lot, I'd admired Joe Pass for many years, and the great Tommy Crook, whom I grew up listening to in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was master of this style. But in fact, it was really in top 40 bands that I learned to do this stuff in the first place. And I'll give you an example of a couple of the kinds of things that I had to deal with back then, and what came of it. Usually it would be funk grooves, really. And I remember a particular one from Betty Wright's Cleanup Woman. And it had 4 really funky guitar parts plus a bass part. And there were only about 3 of us in the band, and one of them was a drummer. He couldn't do any of the parts. And so we ended up trading off and doing all these different parts together. And I remember it was an enormous technical challenge for me, but I learned so much by doing this. It was a combination of just 2 parts, and I'll demonstrate them to you. That's part number 1. Notice I'm doing the backbeat in there as we go just to keep time. The other is the bass part. Okay, so we didn't have enough guys to go around to cover all the parts, and there was still another couple that the great player Terry Saunders used to do. We would switch off and do them, but anyway, the part that I worked out was this. So that's just an example, and we'll include that one in the book so you can figure out how I fingered it. But I guess what I'm getting at is, again, start with real music, whatever that is to you, and figure out how you can take parts out of that and combine them. I used to do little parts like... And you can have a lot of fun with those things. So now that I'm doing what I'm doing with Patty, of course I have to do the whole band thing, and so it gets a little bit more organized than that. I have to do another part or 2 on top of it. So with these, unlike the swing thing, once you get it, or in the case of the swing, once you get it, you can just kind of improvise and make it up as you go along. These have a lot more rigid basic parts that you need to work out as independence exercises, and the individual parts are usually a little bit more syncopated, so it can get a little bit confusing. It took me years to realize that I might have saved a lot of time by writing some of those parts out rather than just by trying to keep it all juggling in my head. And so you might find that that's easier to do. I don't usually do that. But I'll demonstrate a couple of them, and I think in both cases I'm going to tune down to a D here. Use that about a third of the time probably. Okay, so from one of the songs that Patty and I do, Everything's Gonna Be All Right, this is a good illustration of this, this whole concept. It takes advantage of all the different techniques that I use to create this. The first is, you're talking about a 16th note feeling in the bass, and my approach to getting that is using my thumb and doing a double stroke. Just exactly the same kind of technique you would use if you were holding a pick, only you're just doing it with the side of your thumbnail. And I'd like to spend just a minute focusing on this because I found that for many guitarists, this is a rather perplexing technique to get down. And I know for me, it came very slowly. I've seen people get it very quickly. My particular solution to the problem is, in this hand, to actually close my hand up. Instead of playing with a standard classical technique, I close this joint into the hand as far as I can. So you get this. You can see instead of being open like this, it's closed over, and then I open the thumb back up again. So you end up with this instead of that. And the effect of that is that you get a very rigid thumb, which is capable of doing a really strong upstroke. It kind of catches underneath the string. Later I learned to do it just with a standard classical technique, but initially if you lower your thumb into your hand like this, you'll find it'll work really well. Then the downstroke is the traditional stroke, like a rest stroke. The upstroke actually comes out of the guitar and snaps the string a little bit. It's not just an upstroke, it's an outstroke. So you have down as a kind of in-stroke and up as the reversal, which is a kind of outstroke. Okay, well there you've got 16th notes, so you can play any rhythm you want to in the bass. Okay, now with a pick that's pretty easy, and with your thumb, as soon as you get the technique, it's just as easy as it is with a pick. The only problem is you can see my hand is waving back and forth, and it's a different issue if you want to play anything on the top at the same time. So what I found was you can, if you use a slightly different technique in the thumb part, then you can get the fingers to do what they want to do, which is play some chords. And I do this either with a kind of open-handed strum or traditional classical plucking. Here's the open-handed strum. Something like that. I'm using just the tips of 2 fingers, could be the tips of 3 fingers, whatever you like. It could even be your pinky. I do it with my pinky sometimes. Or traditional classical technique. Or a combination of those two. Or you could do something that I find I haven't seen a lot of players do, but it seems to work really well, which is it's the classical technique you use for playing lines, only you use it for playing chords. In this case, I'm strumming 2 or 3 note chords. That's about all you need most of the time. That's about all I find that I can get. By the way, I don't have any fingernails. I cut them off in frustration about 12 years ago and never looked back. I would suggest that you be careful with your nails if you're a classical player trying to do this, because you'll rip your nails all apart. And I can't tell you that much about how to do this properly. You'll have to adjust all kinds of angles and everything else if you're not using fingertips. I do have some fingernail on the thumb, just a short one, and that's what's catching the string on the upstroke. So anyway, the particular part in question on this song, Everything's Gonna Be All Right, or the parts in question were this: 1, 2, 3, 4. You notice I'm still doing the backbeat. I can't turn that off very easily. The chord part was 2, 3, 4, 4. And you notice what I'm doing here is a combination of all those different techniques I was talking about before for hitting chords and the simultaneous down and up strokes in the bass. The most difficult of those is the one that I'll focus on the most, just because I don't think people talk about it very much. And that's the one where you're alternating your index and middle fingers on the chords. So that's the... this part. That can theoretically happen at the same time that you're doing down and up strokes with your thumb. It's not particularly comfortable, but you can do it, and I'll do it really slowly to demonstrate it. if you speed it up, so with freedom like that, where you can do any different syncopation in the bass and in the chords, ultimately you can get the freedom to improvise with this kind of stuff. And that's what I found I've done more and more on a song like this. Originally, when I worked it out, it really was very much an exercise, and the most I could do was just keep it together. But at this point, it becomes a lot more flexible, and I'll just play a piece of that song, which, by the way, to my ear sounds like Patty's missing, but, you know, she's not here right now, so this is what the guitar part would be, something along these lines, if Patty were singing at the same time. Okay, so you get the idea. What you're seeing is that I'm incorporating everything I've talked about in the swing bass, all the different little tricks, the pull-offs, the slides, everything else I know on the guitar. I've just sat down and worked out a way to try to incorporate those in at the same time that I'm doing this funk thing. And the approach, you're seeing something that's a lot closer to the finished product than you're going to do if you haven't done this as much as I have. But the approach is, again, one of whatever it is that you decide you want to isolate and work on, simplify the other parts of it. And then you'll find that it's easy to start focusing on that one part. And the goal is always, I think, to be able to improvise with this stuff. That's one mistake that a lot of solo guitar players make. They try to perfect a version of a song and play it over and over again. And I can't claim that I'm not guilty of the same thing. It's very seductive to try just to improve something and work on the subtleties as opposed to having the kind of improvisatory freedom that you would have if you were doing something much simpler. But that's got to be the goal, because you want to express how you're feeling at the moment, or express whatever it is that wants to come through you at the moment. And you need the flexibility of improvisation ever to have a hope of doing that. To that end, one of the things I'd like to suggest is improvising with single lines at the same time as keeping a bass line together. And my experience has been that that's not really completely impossible, although it approaches it. It's certainly impossible for me to play anything approaching kind of lines that I would play if I were just playing lines. But you can develop it. And when I first started doing this, I made the mistake of working it out. I said, okay, I'll work out a solo, I'll work out a bass line, and I'll actually try to keep the two going at the same time. It'll become like a technical etude for me, and I'll practice it until I get it. And what I found was that it never became music. It was always an exercise. It's a lot more satisfying, I should say, in addition to doing that rather than instead of doing that, because you want to work things out as well. It's a lot more satisfying to simplify it and then just start grooving on it and see where it goes. And so I'll give you an example of the kind of stuff that I might sit around and do. We're back in standard tuning now. Maybe I'll set up the simplest possible bass line first. Might even play it with my thumb. So I'm just keeping every other quarter note going in the bass. Now maybe I'll make the bass a little bit richer. Notice that I'm using my thumb all the time in the bass. That's a useful thing to do, although at some point you want to say, don't let yourself do that. See what all you can get out of not using your thumb. One of the things you'll notice is that I'm less comfortable doing that, not using my thumb. I grew up playing with my thumb this way, and it's taken me a bit of relearning over the years to learn to play anything in a barred position or not using my thumb. I would encourage you to just learn every technique. There is no right or wrong technique as far as I've been able to ascertain. There's just the technique that works to accomplish what you want to get. There's all kinds of reason to play with a very correct classical left hand at certain times. You'll find that you'll get less string noise and every other kind of thing. You'll find it easier to move from one chord to another some of the time. But a lot of the time, the only way you're going to pull off the chord that you want to play is with a technique like this, or the phrasing that you want to get. And so you want to be completely ready to do this, as far as I'm concerned, as well as to do a classical position or something that's modified. Sometimes there are all kinds of positions like a crossed bar that you might want to play. And there's just no other way to, well, of course, in this case, there is another way. But I would suggest that you don't hesitate to use so-called wrong techniques, because you'll find that they turn out to be very right. One of the most useful ones that I've encountered is using your thumb around the front of the fingerboard, which for some reason we don't get taught as guitar players that that's an option. And I can't remember what voicing that I discovered this with, but it might very well have been this one that I really wanted to hear. There was just no way for my hand to play this voicing. I couldn't reach my thumb around and really pull it off. But what I found was it's possible just to loop my thumb right around here on this G. And not only did I have a solid finger on the note, but I could even slide it. So that's just an example. Another one that I came up with was this. Actually, in this, yeah, you couldn't get it in this tuning. You always need a nice 13 sharp 11 chord, don't you? And this is good voicing for it, and it saves you having to try to stretch. It's like a tendonitis chord right there. Much easier just to do this. So again, the suggestion is I'm not a real specialist in this. If you go to see me play, you're not going to see a lot of chords like that. You'll see a couple of places where I really want the voicing, I'll go to the trouble to get it. What I'm suggesting is think about unusual ways to attain whatever it is you want to hear. In both cases, those voicings came from sounds that I wanted to hear. I was hearing that arpeggio in my head. I really wanted to hear that chord. I needed it, and therefore I found a solution to it other than retuning the guitar. So this was a digression from the funk standpoint, but really, in a way, it's what the whole funk groove approach is about, because it's making techniques that shouldn't work together. I'll demonstrate one of these others, which is on a groove in B flat. This is also in a drop D tuning. This one actually has 4 parts to it. It's a cute tune. This is a modification of something that I heard a whole band do. And so here's the bass part. Here's the backbeat. Guitar part. Greatly simplified piano part. That's a pretty fun one, and I would encourage you to try that out. Again, in every case, it's just thinking about what a band would do and working out some way to create it, whether it involves double strokes with a thumb or some technique I've never even thought about using. You'll just find that if you think in terms of doing it, especially if you see somebody else doing it, it's pretty useful to see somebody else doing it and think, oh yeah, I could do that. Because I've had students that learned this stuff in a fraction of the time it took me. If you can save yourself a few hours, I would be very happy about that. If you come back to me and play these things better than I'm playing them, I'll be especially happy about that, because then that'll give me a challenge to work harder. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about chord melody, and what I was just doing was a lot of double bends, just because that's something that's always interested me for a long time. And the reason I mention this is just a lot of people think of chord melody and all of a sudden everything gets real stiff. And it doesn't have to. Chord melody is simply accompanying your own self when you're playing the melody. Doesn't mean you can't do everything you would do to bring the melody to as much life as you can possibly get out of it. And so I'd like to talk about a few things. One is the idea of using bends and double bends. Kind of controversial in jazz, but it really doesn't matter. It's just one of those musical elements that you can choose to use if it interests you. Another one is the idea of sliding. If you want to play a melody, let's say, well, you can do all kinds of slides. And bends. A lot more. It's a lot more interesting than going. Chord melody is not all just block chords. That's very interesting too. But you can. The block chords are just one of the many techniques you can use. Consider, for example, one of the things that I always do when I first learn a tune, and that's bass melody. Now from there, it's just a step. Of course, that's a few steps passed from nowhere, but what I'm suggesting to eliminate a few steps is first map out where the bass is going to be, where the melody is going to be, and then start trying to bring both of them to life as if you've got a duet going on between two voices as opposed to an academic exercise. So let's pretend that you're there. From there, it's just a step to adding in some other notes, getting the chords in there. But it doesn't have to become block chords. Once you've got the bass and the melody, you don't just have to fill it out with a static block of notes. You can bring much more to life than that if you want to. Another thing you can do that I find that particularly brings the melody to life is just letting the melody lead the chord. A lot of people think of the melody as just the top note of the chord and they work down. To me, the melody is the whole life of the song, and then you just let the harmony fill in underneath. See, in every case, I'm letting the melody determine what happens and then following up with the chords after that. Now, of course, you can make the chords as elaborate as you want to underneath, but one of the things is, the more interesting your other parts become, the less anybody's going to notice the melody. This brings up a really important issue when you're doing more than one part at a time, and that's the balance between those different parts. And the model I use to think about it is just a mixing board. You got a fader for each one of the parts. Okay, I'm going to turn up the bass. Let's just fade the melody out a little bit. Get to the point where you can have complete freedom in adjusting those things. And one strong suggestion is, if you're trying to make the melody alive, then try just lowering the volume of everything else. So instead of this, you can see what's happening. I'm just trying to keep the focus on the melody there. And you find this is pretty effective when it comes time to have anybody recognize your tune. The more interesting you're going to make some other part, the softer you better play it, or else nobody will notice what you were originally trying to focus on, which is the melody. Also, you notice I'm doing a lot of arpeggiation with my right hand. This is an example of an idea that's very important to me, which is ripping off everything you possibly can from every other musician that you can get a hold of their music. And in this particular case, the musician in question is Sabicas, the great flamenco guitarist. And at some point, a record fell into my hands of Sabicas. And I slowed it down to half speed, like I always do with anything that I can't figure out at regular speed. And when I finally figured out that there was just one guy playing the guitar, I was very, very depressed for quite a long time, but at least one of the things that I learned from that was all these ascending and descending arpeggios. Some people call these rolls, and you can get to the point where you just go ripping up and down the strings real quick. It sounds like all kinds of textural stuff is going on. Another one that I don't remember where I stole this one. It could have been Earl Klugh, and I don't know where Earl got it, but anyway, here it is. Do it with any finger. Even do it with several fingers. All these things just fill out a kind of well, texture is the word I'm going to use. And again, you'll see as I'm playing a chord melody, I might do that just to bring some texture in underneath the melody. And so forth. And also you can see I'm doing a lot of inner lines moving underneath the melody. I guess what I'm getting at is that a lot of people think, okay, I've got it worked out as a chord melody. I've worked out a course of this tune, it's fine. Now what do I do? Well, you don't want to say that in music. You want to just say, okay, let's let this tune live and breathe and go through every different kind of variation you could possibly find. What if you played the melody and the bass? What if I can play the melody and the bass? Doesn't sound too good, but it's a good exercise to do it. So there's really no end to the ways that you could go about arranging or rearranging a tune. You just want to do it differently every time until you become conversational with it. You can always use your Cleanup Woman riff or any other of your funk riffs as far as I'm concerned. To me, all music is fair game when you're playing any other kind of music. And so I know on a Christmas record that I've just recently done, I actually used Cleanup Woman or a little lick from it because I started thinking, well, how am I going to make Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer sound interesting here? And so I figured, well, what about Cleanup Woman? Let's just marry those two, and I came up with something that went like... You get the idea. I can't quite play it right now, but check it out on the record. So just mix it and match it. As far as I'm concerned, you should just draw from any source you can and then figure out ways to play things. If you get stuck, a suggestion is listen to anybody else playing music and say, gee, what if I tried to do that on guitar? Remember, I listened to Art Tatum one time, who's the incredible piano genius, and there's no way you can do anything Art Tatum did on the guitar. It just all goes by too fast and is just too furious and unbelievable. But on the other hand, you can get all kinds of ideas from him. He's like a textbook of harmony. So if you're running out of ideas for chord substitutions, just randomly put on 3 seconds of Art Tatum anywhere and you'll get all kinds of new ideas. Or in my case, I came up with a texture that I had never thought about. He did these rippling arpeggios full length of the piano, 5, 6 octaves, in about 10 milliseconds it sounded like to me. And so my little attempt to create that effect on the guitar was just to use this same rippling technique I was talking about before, but just run it on arpeggios all the way up the fingerboard. You can get some really nice sounds that way. You can do it on any kind of song. I can't, but let's see if it works. Get the idea. Now, that doesn't sound anything like Art Tatum to me, objectively listening, as it probably doesn't to you. But I've got a footnote in my own mind that I ripped off that lick from Art Tatum. And there are a lot of other licks there ready to be ripped off from people besides guitar players. And one of the nice things about the style of guitar that I've been doing is it doesn't matter. None of that stuff has necessarily been done on guitar, so it's really just open season on all of those things. The other thing I want to mention is slide fingerings. You can get a lot of mileage out of these for whole chords. You can use alternate fingerings all kinds of places in order to slide. For example, this voicing. If you're playing chord melody and you want to go, you can slide right through that. So you can get really lyrical things. Okay, I think we're coming to the end here. I'd like to thank you for listening and watching. There's no way that we can possibly cover everything. We'll be doing other videos and cover a lot more topics. I'd like to get back to some of these in more depth. But if in any way I've saved you any time or given you any kind of inspiration, I'm really grateful. And finally, I would just say, you've got the best guitar teacher in the world right inside you. That's been my experience, which is the voice of your intuition. If there is a God, and I feel like there definitely is, then he's probably sitting there talking to you right now all the time in life, and it certainly applies to guitar playing. You get the best advice right there inside. You'd be amazed at what kind of stuff is just waiting to come out if you listen to it. So I'll sign off here and play a little bit of music for you. Thanks.